Well, good evening. We are going to be into Proverbs tonight. I know that we had discussed last week whether or not we were going to do more of the Psalms or to get into Proverbs. I got almost no feedback, much like every other time I ask what you guys want to do for Bible class. I got one feedback, and the feedback was either Proverbs or Psalms. Happy with both. So I'm going to go with Proverbs tonight. And we're going to go over an introduction. I have my friend Matt here, who is off camera. So if I look over here and talk to him quite a bit, I'm not ignoring you guys. Just it's a lot easier to talk to somebody than it is to talk to a camera. So I appreciate you guys tuning in. If you want to open to Proverbs chapter 1, we'll spend our time tonight with an overview of Proverbs and then look at a couple verses here in chapter 1 to get an idea. Usually, whenever you start into a new book, I always encourage to talk about the author, the date of the writing, and kind of the theme or the purpose behind it. Proverbs is one of those ones that you think is going to be kind of a straightforward answer for all of those, and it's not. Even though you get into Proverbs chapter 1, and in verse 1 it says, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, and you think, okay, problem solved, we know all the answers from here on out. It's not as simple as that. Proverbs is probably better understood as an anthology of Proverbs rather than a single author collection. And what I mean by that is, let's look at a couple of the titles that are used here. Obviously, chapter 1, verse 1 identifies the first author as Solomon, son of David. You get two more titles, or you get the same title twice later on in the book. If you turn over to chapter 22, middle of chapter 22, verse 17. There is some debate over who this individual is in chapter 22. Not really interested in debating that too much tonight. But in chapter 22 and in verse 17, he says, I'm in Isaiah because the wind has taken my pages to the wrong book. That would help out quite a bit. This always goes great. So Proverbs 22 in verse 17, once I get over there, he says, incline your ears and hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to know my knowledge. He uses the same title just two more chapters over into chapter 24, and in verse 23. Chapter 24 and verse 23. He says, these also are the sayings of the wise. Some people have taken this to understand that both in chapter 22 and also in chapter 24, where in chapter 22 he gives you the 30 sayings of the wise, and then in chapter 24 he gives you more sayings of the wise, that the wise is a title that may or may not refer to Solomon. I don't want to get into a lot of debate over it. You can kind of feel however you want to. I personally think that given what we understand of Solomon from 1 Kings, that he probably is referring to himself, where he is given a collection of sayings from chapters 1 through 9, and then starting in chapter 10, he gives this true Proverbs through chapter 22. He then has given a more of a context to chapter 22 and the 30 sayings of the wise, and then continues on into chapter 24 with more sayings of the wise. But that doesn't end the authorship of Proverbs there either. As you get over a couple more chapters into chapter 25, you get this heading over the chapter 25. It says, these are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. And so it appears that whenever Solomon wrote, it appears that Proverbs would have ended by chapter 24. There is a layer addendum that is put on during the time of Hezekiah that the men of Hezekiah, or the scribes of Hezekiah, would have added to using Solomon's own Proverbs. And so from chapters 25 through chapter 29 seem to be an addendum that is added on by Hezekiah's men. Now, to give you a quick idea of that, Solomon reigned from 971 BC to 931 BC. Hezekiah is it's over 200 years later in 715 to 683. I know those are when I say them to me, they're just a bunch of numbers, and probably they're a bunch of numbers to you as well. But the idea being that this seems to be an addendum that's added on to the book of Proverbs about 200 years later, but they are still Proverbs of Solomon. But still, the answer to authorship doesn't end there either. As you move over to chapter 30, we have another title that begins the chapter. He says, the words of Agor, however you want to pronounce that's probably better than ever I pronounce it, son of Jekah, the oracle. The term oracle is going to pop up twice here in the book of Proverbs, here in chapter 30 and also in chapter 31. The word is not exactly precise in the Hebrew. You may have a footnote to the extent that it may refer not to an oracle as an oracle of God, but a person from a certain region of Massa. Whatever the case may be, this individual that is named here in chapter 30, who's one of the authors of Proverbs, is actually completely unknown to us. We don't have really any indication of who this individual is, even though he lists his name and his parentage. And that continues on as you get into another author into chapter 31. At the beginning of chapter 31, we have another title, the words of King Lemuel, the oracle that his mother taught him. Again, this term oracle comes up, whether it's the region that he's from, or he's actually an oracle, that is not precisely understood in the Hebrew. But who is this King Lemuel? Again, the answer is that we don't know. There is no other mention of him in the Old Testament, and the fact that he is a king, and yet he is not mentioned in Kings or Chronicles of Israel or Judah, would indicate that this is probably a Gentile, which would also give you an indication if this person is an oracle or from this one area, and the author of chapter 30 is also unknown to us in the rest of the Old Testament, that he might also be a Gentile. That's all speculation. I think chapter 31 we have a better idea that's probably a Gentile who is writing in chapter 31. There is no mention to Jehovah, even though Jehovah is referenced quite a bit through the rest of Proverbs. Chapter 31 does not contain that. There is no reference to the law either in chapter 31. Again, more indications, probably a Gentile. So chapter 30 and chapter 31 may stand completely unique in the Old Testament as being authored by non-Israelites. So the simple answer of, well, who is the author of Proverbs, which seems to be really simple, it starts off with the Proverbs of Solomon in chapter 1 and verse 1, is actually quite a bit more complicated. So you have two sections in chapter 22 and chapter 24 that are attributed to the wise. Solomon also refers to himself as the preacher in Ecclesiastes, so I have no problem, no difficulty at all understanding him to be the author of chapter 22 and chapter 24. You then have an addendum that is added on during Hezekiah's time over 200 years later of chapters 25 and following, chapter 25 through 29. And then you have two other authors in chapter 30 and chapter 31 who are most likely Gentile contributors to the book of Proverbs. Now, all of that's to say is that the answer is not nearly as clean-cut and clear as we are used to for Old Testament writings. Some people may get a little uncomfortable with the idea that Proverbs was written in one format and remained so for about 200 years before Hezekiah's men added in a couple more chapters, and then maybe even later 2 more chapters being added by other authors. But I just personally feel no hesitation with that this is how it's preserved for us. Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 through 34, it goes on in detail about his wisdom, about the wealth that he has, about the individual who came and to learn from him. And it mentions there that he has spoken 3,000 proverbs and had written 1,005 songs. There's no clear indication that the proverbs that are spoken of here in 1 Kings chapter 4 are necessarily the same proverbs that come up here in the book of Proverbs. Mostly because what is spoken of there in 1 Kings chapter 4 deals a lot more with animal husbandry, and that Proverbs dealing with farming. So there seems to be a lot more other proverbs that Solomon has that are maybe not recorded for us here in the book of Proverbs. So, getting into the date, I mentioned before that Solomon reigned from about 971 to about 931, and then those later sections from chapter 25 through 29 would have been added somewhere in the 700s to late 600s. But the dating is actually not really that important. One of the beauties of the book of Proverbs is that it is kind of timeless, that the dating and the historical context of the writing doesn't really have any strong effect on our understanding. We understand that it was written primarily by Solomon to a Jewish audience, and so that has some aspect on it, but it doesn't really change too much about how we understand it, because while he deals with the law, he is not overly precise on any one aspect of the law, but a better understanding of how to live out the law on a day-to-day basis. The main theme of the book is Solomon's imparting wisdom. We'll talk about some of the character types and some of the audiences in a few minutes, but he is imparting wisdom. And wisdom is maybe not the easiest word to define, but in the context of Proverbs, I'll hazard to give you a really brief definition of the word wisdom. Wisdom can be defined as the skill of living righteously. Where the Pentateuch deals with a lot of what to do, Solomon deals with how to do that on a regular basis inside the book of Proverbs. And so it is not just the knowledge of what the law is, but it is a skill of putting that into practice on a regular basis. So in Proverbs chapter 1, I mentioned that we're going to be looking at a couple verses there. Proverbs chapter 1, he tells you who the audience of the book is. Now, throughout most of the later sections, he's going to talk about my son and deal with how a son is going to interact with his father and with his mother, whether he's wise or whether he's foolish. But he gives a broader audience in chapter 1, verses 4 and verse 5. So Proverbs chapter 1, verse 4, he says, "To give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth, let the wise hear and increase learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance." And so he gives his audience as being the simple, the wise, the youth, and the one who has understanding. These are the individual that he's talking to throughout the book of Proverbs. Some have suggested that he is writing to his courtiers or directly to his children, individuals who would serve at a high-ranking position to give them knowledge and skill in living inside of his kingdom. But as you look at Proverbs, it's much more of a broad audience than that. He's not dealing with a particular son that he's writing to, but any of the people that is his audience who are his children. He deals with Proverbs that deal with how to deal with being poor, as well as how to go before a king, how to deal justly in the marketplace, or how to handle simple arguments between people. The Proverbs are not limited in scope to one particular class or one particular people. They work for anybody at any point in time, which is the true beauty of the timelessness of the book of Proverbs, that it impacts anybody that they come across. So part of the key understanding of Proverbs is understanding the character types that Solomon writes to. So he does, as Proverbs is, he personifies wisdom, he personifies the adulterous woman, kind of condensing a whole bunch of things into one person to give you an idea. He also creates throughout the book these characters of people. And what I mean by that he, as you look at a character at a carnival, they take your features and they over dramatize them in order for you to understand clearly who that person is instantly. The same thing happens here in Proverbs, where he's going to lump the wise into one category. And the wise is going to be defined by somebody who embraces God's covenant on a continual basis. That isn't to say that if you are wise in one area, you are wise in all areas. It's a character of someone who is wise. The same thing happens to the fool. The fool is another predominant character inside the book of Proverbs. And that is anybody who opposes God's covenant. And just because you're a foolish in one area, it doesn't mean that you're a fool in all areas. He also talks to the simple. We mentioned that here in Proverbs chapter 1. He writes to, in verse 4 and verse 5, the prudence, he writes to give prudence to the simple. And the simple seems to be someone who has neither committed his way to wisdom or to foolishness, that he's someone indecisive or on the line. And so Solomon writes to this individual in order to persuade him to choose wisdom and to abandon foolishness. There are also some middling terms that go along with this, where they're not necessarily wise or foolish or simple, but they're positive and negative terms, the characters that come up throughout the book. In positive terms, he talks about the righteous, the upright, the diligent, the understanding, and the prudent. All of these would be some varying degrees on individuals who are wise. In the negative sense, he also talks about the wicked, the lazy, and the lacking in sense. Again, somewhere on the needle compass point of the fool or the simple. But all of these are characters where it appears at first that he is talking to them in cut and dry circumstances. But as you get in the book, a discerning reader is going to understand that these are not one and done deals, that all of us fall somewhere on the spectrum of foolish to wise in some aspects of our lives. And other aspects will fall in a different part of that spectrum of foolish to wise. But the main focus of the book is the fool and the wise. And interestingly enough, what is really neat about the book of Proverbs is that the main characters are not the righteous and the unrighteous. And that makes all the difference in understanding the book of Proverbs. It is very, very realistic as you go through Proverbs that there are God's people who are diligently trying to follow His will who are acting foolishly. And He rebukes you for acting foolishly, but doesn't mean that necessarily you are unrighteous. Even though there are some people that He mentions in the book who are unrighteous. There are some Proverbs that deal directly with the balance of scales, which is a part of the Old Testament law and dealing righteously with individuals. But just because you read through that and you see foolish does not automatically equate with unrighteous or ungodly, or someone who is who is actively seeking to destroy those who are religious. That those are not synonymous terms throughout the book. He's dealing with those who are wise and those who are foolish, those who are skilled in living righteously, or those who are not skilled in living righteously. And that makes a big difference. And so what we're dealing here in Proverbs is not commands and edicts of thou shalls and thou shalt nots, but directives on how to live better, or how to live more righteously, or how to put those things into practice. So let's define just for a few moments what a proverb is. Proverbs here is going to be a short 2 or 3 line saying that belies a greater meaning or a greater understanding. We do this all the time. Every culture has proverbs. Every culture has different truth sayings. And Proverbs is no different in that way. But if you notice, the first couple of chapters of Proverbs aren't actually Proverbs. That is one of the more confusing things maybe as you open the book of Proverbs. You start reading throughout chapter 1, then chapter 2 and chapter 3, and you have a narrative that flows the first 9 chapters rather than short pithy sayings that are actually Proverbs. And all of that goes to set up his wisdom under his wisdom statements. And the Proverbs really begin in chapter 10 and verse 1. And if you look at the heading over chapter 10, it actually starts with the Proverbs of Solomon, and then you get into the actual Proverbs. So chapters 1 through 9 work together as narratives to set up wisdom, to set up foolishness, to set up the character types that he's going to be talking about, and then chapter 10 gets into the Proverbs proper. As you get over into chapter 22, he then gets into the 30 sayings of the wise. Chapter 25 will be, or chapter 24 will be more sayings of the wise. Chapter 25 through 29 is the collection that Hezekiah's men gathered together and added. And then chapter 30 and 31 are the 2 additional authors of the book. But these are 2 or 3 line sayings that give a real truth, but also carry a deeper meaning behind it. We use statements like this all the time that, many hands make quick work. well, that's a true statement for this particular very precise sentiment, but it also belies greater truth for larger applications in life. The same thing comes up in Proverbs, where it'll be a short, quick, memorizable statement that carries a lot of meaning to it, and it is not there to give you full and in-depth understanding for every circumstance, but it's something that you have to keep in your mind so that whenever a circumstance pops up, I have the right proverb that fits this circumstance. So, a chapter 11, for instance, in verse 1, is a good one for that. So he gives this short, brief statement in verse 1 that a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but just weights are his delights. And while this is a true statement when it comes to the law of God and what God wants, it also belies a greater truth of an honest and a good work ethic. That God doesn't just want correct balances and just weights. He wants us to work diligently in all the things that we do, and to deal truthfully and justly in all of our aspects, all of our dealings with other people. And so the quick statement that we are to memorize is that false balances are an abomination to the Lord, and that just weights are his delight. That's the statement that is true, but it has this deeper meaning that applies to all of our work ethic. And that is one of the beauties that Proverbs have. That's why we always have them in our English language. That's why every language has their own Proverbs. Something that's a short, simple saying that you can remember that carries deeper meaning to apply to various aspects of our life. There's also contradictions or seeming contradictions in the book of Proverbs. The most notable is in chapter 26. If you go over chapter 26, we see this here in verse 4 and verse 5, where seemingly after Hezekiah's men gathers these sayings and adds them into the book of Proverbs from Solomon, seemingly they tie verse 4 and verse 5 together, and it seems to just not make any sense the first time you read it. The first one is, "Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself." And then verse 5 is the exact opposite. "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." Well, that seems to go against one another. And if you think about our proverbs that we have in English, they are very, very similar. We mentioned before that many hands make quick work. We also have a proverb that says that too many cooks in the kitchen ruin a soup. That seems to go against one another, that if you had more hands in the kitchen, quick work. But also too many hands in the kitchen also ruin the soup. The point is that not every proverb fits every circumstance, and understanding the difference between them is key. And so what we have is a collection of proverbs that fits a variety of circumstances, and part of our goal is to understand which proverbs fit which circumstances. And so in some circumstances here in chapter 26, you should answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. But there are other circumstances in which you should not answer a fool according to his folly, lest you become like him. And it's up to us to figure out which of our life circumstances does that apply to. And so as you go through Proverbs, understanding that these are true isms rather than commandments makes all the difference in the world. So there'll be some circumstances that these fit into, and there'll be some circumstances that these proverbs don't fit into. And that's part of the skill in living righteously, is understanding which one is which. But part of that all begins with just getting into the book of Proverbs to begin with, and to understand the wisdom that Solomon has, so that whenever we do face those life circumstances, we have those nuggets that are memorizable, that we can then apply that greater truth to our daily lives. So, to kind of recap a couple things, Solomon is the most abundant author in the book of Proverbs. He starts there in chapter 1, giving him the title. From chapters 1 through 9, he gives a series of wisdom statements that are going to get you ready for the rest of the book of Proverbs. Starting in chapter 10 and verse 1, it says the Proverbs of Solomon, and then he actually gives you a list of Proverbs. They do have some rhyme and reason. Solomon mentions Ecclesiastes, that he spent a lot of time writing and arranging Proverbs. And so there is some flow to it, and there is some context, but it takes some time to suss out those contexts inside of those chapters. But from chapter 10 on through chapter 21, you have the Proverbs of Solomon. Starting in chapter 22, you have the 30 sayings of the wise, which I believe to be Solomon. And the same thing in chapter 24, more sayings of the wise. At the beginning of chapter 25, you have the collection of Solomon's Proverbs that were later added on about 200 years later by Hezekiah's men. And then in chapter 30 and 31, you have two additional authors who we don't know anything extra biblically about. But seeing that King Lemuel was a king, and he is not recorded in any of the kings of Israel or Judah, indication may be that he was a Gentile. The dating, while is understandable from the 900s, roughly the 970s to 930s, the dating isn't necessarily important because the historical context isn't the main part of the book. It doesn't give a great understanding. The wisdom is wisdom because it's wisdom from God, and it's applicable at any point in time. And that's what the book is about. What time are we looking at? I don't want to keep you guys too late tonight. All right, let's go ahead and look into the first couple of verses of chapter 1. Proverbs chapter 1. So he begins there with the introduction. Verses 1 through 7 work as the introduction. He's going to tell you who he is, Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, and then to tell you the purpose of his book, which is to know wisdom and instruction and understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealings, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth, to let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who is understanding to obtain guidance, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. And then he gives you the key to everything that follows in verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and fools despise wisdom and instruction. So he gives you what is the beginning of wisdom. So remember, the two main characters, the two main caricatures that come up in Proverbs is the wise and the fool. The one who has knowledge and the one who despises instruction. And he gives those understandings here in verse 7, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fear of the Lord that he speaks of, I think we've talked about this, it's been a few months since we've talked about this at Colonial. The fear of the Lord is a deep respect. That is often how we term that in our normal conversations, but the fear of the Lord is a deep respect, a deep understanding of him. And we often use references for us here in the South, us who like our guns, a respect for a handgun or respect for a rifle. We understand that has great power and it can be very dangerous if handled improperly. The problem with that is that the Bible also clearly defines the fear of the Lord as shaking and trembling and just great fear. Understanding that God holds us in the palm of our hand to live, to die, to condemn, or to justify. That those are within his realms and his abilities. And we are completely powerless and helpless to change any of that by our own accord. That we rely fully and completely on his grace and following his instructions to please him. That our fear of the Lord needs to be a trembling and a quaking when we are not living righteously. It should be true fear. And that, he says here in Proverbs, both the respect and the trembling and quaking at times is the beginning of knowledge. That if you want to begin with knowledge, you don't start off with Dr. Spock's book. You don't start off with in Psychology 101. You don't go to a community college or an Ivy League school in order to learn wisdom. It begins with the fear of the knowledge of God. You can't gain knowledge from anyone, true knowledge, from anyone but God. And then he mentions that the opposite, the foil to that, is that fools despise wisdom and instruction. And the problem with that is that that's where most of us lie. I don't know too many people who genuinely just look forward to the day where someone comes along and says, hey, I know how you've been acting and it's been wrong, and I'm here to tell you how to do things better. I don't know of anybody who just says, I can't wait till Thursday. Thursday's the day that they're going to tell me I did everything wrong. This is going to be great. we don't like that naturally. We like to be people who are well sorted, people who have things figured out, and we don't like to be disciplined or instructed. And what Solomon is priming us to do throughout the rest of this book and the rest of our lives is to be people who relish being corrected for the opportunity of growing closer to God. And that's a hard thing. But that is the key to understanding the rest of the book. Fear the Lord, looking forward to being instructed and corrected. With those two things in mind, then you can continue on with the rest of the book. If you don't begin with trembling in your boots a little bit over understanding who God is and your position before Him, and if you don't want to be instructed by Him and be corrected by Him, then there's no point in continuing Proverbs. There's no point moving on with this book because it's not going to do you any good. That's what Solomon is telling you here. So this is for the person who is young and wants to have knowledge and discretion. This is for the one who is wise and wants to increase in their learning. This is for one who has understanding and wants to obtain guidance. This is for those who are prudent or the simple so that they become prudent. And he begins here in verse 8 down through 18 to give some of that instruction. So he says, "Hear, my son." And this isn't, again, as we said, this terminology comes up throughout the entire book of my son. This is Solomon as a father writing to his son. But this son is a proverbial son in the sense that the wise and the fool are caricatures. The son here is anybody who would sit at his feet and learn from his instruction. So hear, my son, your father's instructions, and forsake not your mother's teaching. For they are graceful garlands for your head and a pendant for your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. He mentions here that the words of your parents, this, again, truisms, not every parent is going to give wise sayings. Not every parent is going to be giving these graceful things for you to hear. But there's a truism that parents generally want what is best for the children. Even if they don't know how to give it to them, they do their best. Now, Solomon's writing from a standpoint of one who is inspired,